The Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida.
Welcome to episode 24 of the Florida Podcasting News Show on the Florida Podcast Network. Florida Podcasting News keeps you on the inside of Florida's podcasting industry.
On today's episode, we talk about cancel culture and how it is infiltrating the world of podcasting with our guest, Alex Sanfilippo, a brand strategist and podcaster out of Jacksonville.
Thanks for joining us.
This is Jemmy.
And this is Glenn. Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Florida Podcasting News Show.
Welcome back, Glenn. It is so nice that you are actively on the microphone for what's turning into at least over a week now, maybe 2 weeks, I think. You've been actively back on the mic, Glenn. I'm so happy to see you recovering. Your voice sounds fantastic. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling much better. Thank you very much. It was a rough couple months, but definitely feeling much better now. I'm eating again, so that's good.
Yeah,
Not
that's
eating
a start.
for a couple months will make you lose some energy.
How many pounds did you drop?
30 pounds in about 4 weeks.
So is that a diet you would recommend for me? Because
getting
No.
parts cut out and multiple hospital visits and infections and antibiotics, it's just not a good method.
No, it is not.
No.
It is
Cancer.
not.
I don't recommend any of that, actually. So
no, not at all. Not at all. But I am so glad that you're feeling better. Can the listeners know that you're pretty much out of the woods, or can they get comfort in that?
Yeah. They got the cancer. I don't have to have chemo. Cancer led to a massive internal infection, which led to a lot of pain, which then killed my gallbladder, and I had to have that out. But all of that cycle, I think, is gone now. I do have a funny story. So with the several surgeries I had the same surgeon each time. And he was trying to figure out all of this that was going wrong.
Well, you're in Ocala. There can only be so many.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was so funny because I went in for the follow-up after the second surgery and was finally feeling better. And he poked his head around the corner and he said, "Please tell me your pain is gone because I'm running out of things to cut out."
Oh, I could have made a couple extra suggestions.
But you know what? Talk about a surgeon with a sense of humor.
Well, good. That's good to have. And you also had a lot of support, and not only from your listeners, your family, your friends, but from family and friends within the podcast space specifically. And I know one of them in particular needs a really, really big shout out.
Yeah, Lee Silverstein, who does the cancer podcast, does We Have a Cancer show, was checking in on me almost every day. I mean, since I found out I had cancer, he started with colon cancer as well, and he's still battling it 10 years later. And he would check in on me, and if I had a question about what was going to happen next, he would tell me, or if I had to figure out what my next step should be. And then when things didn't go right after the surgery, then he was checking in and giving me suggestions. So, he definitely helped me get through this, as well as Chris, over at Podfest and a ton of other podcasters, too numerous to mention. And even Jemmy checked on him occasionally.
Who's that? I don't know who you're talking about.
But it was wonderful. The support, and the support from the listeners was off the charts. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was crazy. But yeah, so thank you, Lee. And Lee, he just got an honor too, right?
He did. And I'm so proud of him. I know you're so proud of him too. But he got the number 2 spot of the top 15 cancer podcasts you must follow in 2020 list. That is phenomenal. I'm so proud of him because it is a really good show. He actually retooled his show. I remember he told us this several years ago because it started really as, a show about him with his cancer. And what he realized was
it was the colon cancer podcast.
Right. Yes, you're right. Exactly. And through that experience and through talking to people, it became so clear that cancer, it doesn't just affect the person who has it, it also affects the people who love them and are caring for them and are there for them and supporting them. And so he changed the name of his show to the wehavecancershow.com. And that's where you can find it. And it's so good. And we just want to give many, many props and congratulations to Lee for making number 2 on that list. So yay to Lee.
Good job, Lee.
Good job.
Thanks for all your support. I know he listens to this show, so he'll hear this.
Absolutely. So the guest that we have on today, his name is Alex. And I found out about this article that he wrote and the reason why he's on the show today, because I got it in my inbox. And speaking of inboxes, you want to make sure that you are emailing us with your really amazing news so we can feature you on a future episode of this show. So if you are a Florida podcaster, if you've done something cool or, have something interesting to talk about and you want to be highlighted on the show, just email me. You can reach me at Jaime, Jaime, at FloridaPodcastNetwork.com. And you can find all of our archival shows at FloridaPodcastingNews.com. And with that, we're going to go and talk to Alex. Yeah, we're so excited to bring brand strategist and podcaster and our friend Alex. He's out of Jacksonville, Florida, and he wrote this really, really, really good article that kind of scared the crap out of me, but also gave me a little sense of like, okay, I have a sense of direction and how to handle this thing. We're going to talk about cancel culture with Alex today. And cancel culture has been something that's been of new terminology as of late. So hello, Alex. Welcome.
Hey, thanks so much. I'm sorry I scared you with this article. I was hoping it would help you. But
it did a little bit of both.
It's Alex's job to terrify podcasters everywhere.
Right? Yeah. Not the goal.
Not the goal at all. But being a brand strategist and working with different companies and advising people on how to build their brands, especially with podcasters, our podcasts are our babies, right? And we want to make sure that we're protected and that they're protected. And so what is the cause of my fear? What is the lay of the land with this cancel culture thing that's going on right now?
Yeah, I definitely called it cancel culture, but it goes actually far beyond that. That's just one of the things we really saw a lot of around election season. For us as American people, everyone has the right to vote however they'd like to, but a lot of people don't agree with the way that we choose. And to me, it's kind of sad. I think, again, that's part of our freedom, but we're not going to jump into all that. But people would decide, okay, I don't want to be associated with you anymore because you're not voting the way I am. And we saw a lot of that happening to different podcasters. They were getting asked to remove episodes with past guests who just didn't agree with them politically or didn't align. And I thought that was, again, kind of sad to see, but we definitely saw that problem. But it actually goes a little bit further than that. It also goes into somebody who was a past guest and the episode goes viral, if you will, which happens occasionally in podcasting. It gets picked up by somebody writes about it on Forbes or on Entrepreneur. And that gets a lot of exposure. Sometimes the guest goes back and says, I want a piece of that profit now because I know you're making a lot of money from this. And I feel I deserve some of it because I was the guest, right? So there's a lot of different ways that we've actually been seeing this type of thing happen. So not just cancel culture. It's kind of like a very broad area of people being like, hey, I no longer want that episode anymore, or I want this because of that episode. And it's kind of like you said earlier, it's a little bit of a scary thing that we see starting to happen in podcasting.
Do you think it kind of boils down to guests wanting more of a sense of control over what happens after the recording ends?
Sometimes I've seen that, and sometimes it comes from seeing, again, someone else's success, and they feel like they want to be a bigger piece of that. There's a lot of reasons behind it, but yeah, I do think that some of it is that they feel like they want the control over it because their voice is on it.
Yeah.
And I think just naturally people think if it's got my voice or has my face or something like that, I should own that, right?
And that's really aggravating as a person who is, we're the ones who, we book them, we've put the show together, we've been building this platform for however long we've been in it, and it's ours. Just like if I were to be a guest on someone else's show, or I've had the opportunity to be interviewed on like news and stuff like that, and so I can imagine saying, if someone paints me in a wrong light, it's because the words came out of my mouth. So I don't know. But you mentioned politics, but this can happen for a few different reasons. I've seen cancel culture type issues pop up when it's not even just politics. It can be, someone using a word that other people deem very offensive, or expressing a view that people deem very offensive. And, so it's just, the problem can be pretty widespread. I know that there's some, the horse world's not one that's safe from politics. You guys have your own kinds of politics and stuff like that. But
what?
Oh yeah,
I made up
interview
people.
you for this article.
Any place there's more than 3 people, you'll have politics, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So how have you seen? You laid out an interesting flow of how this kind of phenomenon can happen to a podcaster. So the podcasters that are listening to, what are some of those steps in the process that they might start to say, okay, this might be an issue here in a couple of weeks? What are the early signals?
Yeah. So, well, first off, I wanted to prove that what we're talking about is true. And you brought up something that you being a guest on other podcasts, but you're also a podcast host. I only found out of it's nearly 200 different people who have written in and said something on this topic, how it's happened to them. only, I think 2 or 3, maybe 3 people have actually said that it was another podcast host that came on as a guest that they had an issue with. It's the people that don't realize the amount of work that goes into producing a podcast. So it's the people that are only guests.
That's true.
Not usually someone else who's a host, which I thought was interesting. But you and I, we know what goes into this. Like for me, I'm the guest today, which means when I'm done, I can just go walk into the room and hang out, and I've got nothing else going on. I can get caught up on Mandalorian or whatever I want to do, right?
The rest of the work is up to us.
You've got hours of work to do after this, or your teams have hours of work to do. So for me, it's pretty easy later on to be like, I didn't really like it. Can you delete it? And there's not much for me. I just showed up and talked for 20 minutes or whatever it might be, right?
Right.
And so I think it's important to mention that where I'm seeing the problem is the people that don't understand what podcasters are doing. And again, I had almost 200 responses at this point that have been, I consider to be very valid responses. So people listening to it, if you're a podcast host and you're like, this would never happen. I know Glenn says that this would never happen sometimes.
Yeah, no, I'm knocking on wood right now.
Right.
That never happened in all the episodes.
Hasn't happened yet.
Which is awesome.
But that yet might be carrying a lot of weight. We don't know.
My attorney that I work with Podmatch and creating a brand, I think it's her job to like keep the fear of God in her clients. I think that's just how she gets paid, right? And she's like, Alex, it's not a matter of if you'll get sued, it's when. And I was like, what? Why'd you say that? I'm like, I don't want to get sued for anything. You know, like, what did I do?
And then you stare at the ceiling the whole rest of the night. Like, oh, crap.
Right? So I'm like, what if what I told that person doesn't work? You know, like, what if I gave them some bad advice? But anyway, sorry, I know I took that off track a little bit, but I wanted to make sure they kind of set that context that this is something that we are actually seeing happen. And hopefully it never happens to anyone listening to this, but it does happen to some people, and it's super unfortunate. And it's something that we need to think about. So kind of going right into the flow of it, I kind of identify just a handful of things. You start off obviously as a host, you find a guest for your show, right? Like that's the first thing you do. And hopefully it's a guest that's in your niche, somebody that you really want to talk to. And then next thing that happens is you record the show together. So again, that's pretty quick. And then the show goes live and everyone's super excited and happy, or hopefully. And then after that, the host will say that, you know, they talk bad about one of Glenn's horses. Somebody else hears that and gets offended by that because they love Glenn's horses, apparently.
Oh, and I do too. One of them's my boyfriend. Yeah. Just letting you know.
Well, let's say somebody talked bad about it and now you're the guest and you say, hey, I don't agree with that. Like that needs to be taken down. And actually, I'm going to tell all of Glenn's followers that, you know, you said something bad about this. And everyone kind of gangs up on you and says, you got to take that episode down. We don't want to see that anymore because you said this, this, and this. And again, it sounds extreme, but we have actually seen this happen. And guess what we've seen kind of happen is they don't usually take legal action, at least right away, but they've gotten very vocal. Like I've had some people send me some emails what people said to them, and it's extremely rude and hurtful. And just, man, it's sad that we live in a world that has this type of reaction to things, but it's definitely a real thing. And then the last thing we see is some of these people that actually have lawyers that work with them, and they will take immediate legal action to say, hey, I never signed anything. Therefore, you legally have to take this down.
Wow. So, okay. I mean, my mind is absolutely buzzing because what are some of the consequences other than facing a lawyer and asking someone to take down a particular episode? Did anyone respond saying that they have lost their whole show over it or they got threatened to lose their show? That's one question. Another question is, did the circumstances always boil down to legal, or is it sometimes just like social? You know, people can get blasted on social media and it just grows and grows and grows and takes on almost a mind of its own as people pile on. Yeah.
First off, to answer the first part of your question there, I had not seen anybody's show get taken down. Nobody referenced that. The only time I think that would happen is if somebody built a show around an individual and maybe talking about that one person and they didn't like it. And that would be a totally different scenario in my mind. If somebody had like a bashing podcast or something like that the actual person they're talking about didn't like it. But other than that, it's really just episode by episode. I've never seen anything else happen like that. Now, there was a couple cases where the person was so mad that even after their episode got taken down, they still told everybody not to subscribe that podcast. They still talk trash about the rest of the show and stuff like that. Very few cases, but actually, you know, all press is good press type of thing. That probably didn't hurt it too bad unless they're all leaving terrible reviews or something like that. But all in all, we didn't see anything like that happening. But on the individual basis, when it came down to an episode, we definitely saw where things were happening, not just from a legal standpoint. Again, that was more on the rare side, but really from a social media standpoint, being like, hey, a bunch of people are going to leave you bad reviews.
Right.
Or I'm telling this group that I'm part of, they need to never listen to you, or they need to say something mean about you. We were actually seeing the cases where that was happening. And I tried my best to talk to those hosts and ask them how they handled it. And a lot of them, they kind of just had to respond. And some of them took it down. Others said I wouldn't, and they just blocked them and ignored it. But all in all, I think it was really hurtful to a lot of podcast hosts, which was really sad because you guys know the amount of work that goes into this stuff and the passion that goes into it. Right. It's disheartening when something like that happens.
I listened to a show called The Feed that's put on by Libsyn, and Rob Wash over there. I remember a conversation not that long ago that someone brought this up and he said flat out, no, I'm not taking it down. If it's out there, I am absolutely not taking it down. Now, he didn't bring up whether or not he's used release forms and anything like that, but he didn't say it. So I'm assuming no. And so that led me to wonder if what I do is enough. And I know you're not a lawyer and I'm not a lawyer and Glenn is certainly not a lawyer, but
not me.
But
you know my lawyer.
Oh, God. Yeah, my brother's your lawyer. He's also coincidentally mine. But I'm wondering, so before, for you, I mean, we didn't really have to, but with other guests, and I know Glenn does this sometimes too, and there's back and forth. There's an email trail of inviting someone on. There's, before you start recording, you might hit the recorder, but before you start actually getting into the interview, you might have a little bit of something at the beginning that says, this is pre-recorded, you give consent, that you verbally record. And so you maybe keep that, right? And you hold on to that. And just in case someone comes at you, you can say, no, here's the recording of you saying that you can release that. That's kind of what I kind of was saying. Maybe that's all that's necessary and not necessarily the release form, but you're really pushing that the release forms are necessary. I'd love to hear that.
I actually like the route that you just said. I think it's a lot easier. Will it hold up if somebody gets a lawyer involved? No, probably not, even though you have them saying it, because there was no actual written consent. And that's kind of where I think that the release form is needed. And I talked to a handful of some of the bigger podcasters that have thousands of episodes, and they all say you have to have a release form. They're like, I wouldn't do it without one. And just because they're bringing on, I'm not going to call any of them out, but they're bringing on a lot of entrepreneurs and things like that. Some of these people I was talking to. I personally like the idea of just saying, hey, I just want to make sure I'm going to be doing this, this, and this with it. And you get that recorded. For I'd say 90% of the time, that's going to work great. There's the rare cases where somebody has a lawyer that's working with them. If they're part of a big organization and they get involved, that won't hold up. And so for that reason, for me, it makes a lot of sense just to have the actual release form. And also when somebody signs something, they seem to really take it seriously. And I think that probably, even at a subconscious level, keeps somebody from coming back if they don't like it, because they're like, well, I signed over,
right,
that I was okay with this.
Right.
So anything is better than nothing, though. I will say that it's better than just what I did for the first 6 months of my podcast, which was nothing. Just cool. Well, you ready to record? Let's go.
I got to jump in here. We do 20 guests a week. Doing a release form would be a nightmare,
especially keeping it on schedule.
The guests would not figure out how to sign it. We wouldn't know whether they got it in time. It would just be a freaking nightmare.
It can be very complex. There's a couple podcasts I've been on where it's like a 10-minute process going through it.
Oh, they'd never do it. I'd never get half my guests.
Right. Yeah. And I understand that side of it. And that's why I say sometimes it's okay if you're just even checking a box or something like that. What we did with Podmatch is we built it right into the actual scheduling. So when you're actually connecting with somebody via Podmatch to have them on your show to go on their show, if someone just desires to have the built-in release form, they can just actually check a box, sign their name, and press OK.
Oh, that's
so
cool.
It's just an extra 10 seconds in the process. And that was something we wanted to do to help out. But yeah, Glenn, you bring up a good point. I don't know how to streamline that yet. And I don't know that anybody really has.
I mean, we're booking 20 guests a week. It's a nightmare to begin with. I mean,
right. Oh, I can't imagine.
There's 100 emails right there.
I book one a week. And it's a nightmare. So I don't even know what world you're living in.
So I would just be so hard to do.
It would.
Yeah, it would. I mean, and that's why I think that we have to get somewhat creative. I think what you guys do is you all beforehand kind of do the consent type of thing, right?
Yeah. And I'm talking to them about their horse in most cases. So,
right.
It's not, we have discussed this in the past, that if somebody came back to us for whatever reason and said, take my interview down, we would take it down. And we would just not even argue the point. And usually, let's be honest, if they're coming to you after 30 days, unless it's one that went viral for some reason, nobody's listening to it after that anyway. So, you've gotten the downloads, majority, 80% of the downloads you're going to get on that episode. We also talked about this. I'd probably cut their interview out and say, I would record a piece and say, this interview has been removed by the request of the guest.
Because what if there's another guest on there that was part of the episode,
well,
it's a separate segment or something. Yeah.
But I would cut that guest out and I would put in a recording that says this interview has been removed as a request of the guest. And then leave the episode up.
Yeah, I think that actually makes a lot of sense to do
well,
something
and it
like
also
that.
gives a shot across the bow to the guest, doesn't it?
Right. I mean, I think if you tell the guest, okay, I'm going to take it down, but I'm going to do this, that might be a really interesting way to handle things. Because I think if I were the guest saying I want to take it down, and then you tell me that, okay, we're just going to mention that you asked us to take it down, we're going to keep that episode just that, I might be like, you know what, maybe leave it up. Like, because that does look negative on me. That's actually a pretty interesting strategy I had never thought of.
I love you.
Well, I'm not sure it'd work.
Okay,
You know, they still could come back and scream for whatever reason.
Right.
You know, let's take this beyond this too. And, you know, a little bit. And Jemmy will tell you this since I've known her. We have a policy on our shows because we talk about horses that we don't talk about politics and we don't talk about religion. That's a rule for all hosts. And I don't talk about politics at all on any of my social media ever. As a matter of fact, it was probably 1.5 to 2 years of Jemmy and I knowing each other before we ever talked about politics at all.
Oh, wow. That's good, though.
And we
Yeah, but when I
traveled
guessed
together
it,
to
I
do a
nailed
show.
it, didn't I? I nailed it.
We guessed it, but we never discussed it, you know? So, you know, that's one area that we are careful about because of that. You know, because of this problem, the cancel culture.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, I admire that because I think that too many people jump right into it when really I'm not saying it's everyone's right to talk about it if they want to, but there's just no reason to bring it into everything. And I think that shoving politics into everything we do just it makes a really, I guess, a world on edge, right? Like you can tell anytime there's like any sort of election happening, doesn't have to be a presidential election. Everyone's kind of like a little bit more on edge. There's no reason to bring that up all the time. I mean, you guys have a positive podcast. Just keep it focused on its main topic. Well, and I think that's a really good point.
If your show's about puppy dogs and daffodils, you don't need to talk about politics.
Right?
And, you know, I think the bigger you get as a podcaster, right, the more audience you have, the more important it is, unless your show's about politics, let's take that out, right? Mm-hmm. In some way, shape, or form. But if you're doing a show about flowers, they don't care how you feel about politics. And a matter of fact, I don't want to know how you feel about politics.
Because you like those daffodils and you don't want to be turned off and not get them.
But that's
you mean
true,
you wouldn't listen to a podcast that's titled Daisies, Sunflowers, and Biden? You wouldn't listen to that?
Probably not.
That would be super weird. But, you know, I almost wonder if this is another one of those little signs, right? You know, those kind of whispers in the wind that podcasting is just, it's growing up as an industry, right? It's becoming, for good or for bad, more legitimized. And so, you know, I'm thinking about, well, Glenn, like, for example, you had Priscilla Presley on, you know, as a guest. You've had a whole bunch of really, really well-known names, people who have agents and publicists and managers, and they know, like, if they were being interviewed for anything else, right, TV, radio, whatever, there wouldn't have been even a chance without a release form from their side. Yeah. So the fact that they were on with, and it never even came up, I think is very interesting because now we're seeing this kind of start to percolate in the industry as possibly the future necessity, you know?
Yeah, as I understand it, maybe you could correct me on this, that in radio for years, the guests would come on, the musician or whatever, they weren't signing release forms.
I have no idea.
I have no idea either. I might be too young for that, Glenn. I got to be real.
Oh, don't say that, Alex. Don't say that.
Sorry.
You're such a jerk.
I didn't mean anything by it.
Our conversation's over. Interview's done.
I mean, it started off with some nice compliments, and then it led to this.
I'm canceling him right now.
Here we go.
You're an ageist, sorry. Alex.
I don't know anything about radio. I'm sorry.
You ageist. No, but for real.
Listen, you own the podcasting space, so you all are all right.
Oh my gosh, this is very interesting. I think it's going to be really good food for thought for a lot of people. Where can they go to find this full article? Yeah,
if you just go to podmatch.com/blog, it's one of the main featured ones, and it will be for a very long time. So for sake of evergreen, it'll be on there.
So no one's going to threaten to have you take it down? That wants to cancel your cancel culture blog?
Not unless you guys actually pursue that. I mean, now that we've talked. So I plan on actually adding this episode to the actual blog post now, and we'll see if you all let me keep it up.
Well, look at that. That's fantastic. Yeah, all right. You can twisted our arms.
You know, I want to mention something, Jemmy, that you just mentioned that I think is worth kind of capitalizing on a little bit more. You mentioned that this is kind of like a maturing industry, and if there's one thing we've known to be true in any industry, as it gets more and more mature, more money it comes into it, and as more money shows up, so do more lawyers. So do more problems. So there's more news. Like, it's just the truth, right? Like, there are people who come alongside the industry as things are changing. We're starting to see attorneys that are actually specifically in the podcasting space come on board. Like that's where they decided to focus. So
wow.
I think you're right. Like as this grows, it's becoming mature, it's becoming an adult. It's time to start actually thinking about that long term. There's a lot of money in it. We're seeing every trend in podcasting, which you all know. Podcasting is not going anywhere. It is continuing to climb and climb and climb.
Mm-hmm.
So you brought up an interesting point there that I think we have to be thinking about the future. What does it look like in a few years from now? And how can we protect ourselves and our content? I think that's got to be the perspective of a podcast host.
Exactly. And that in terms of what we've been talking about here, and we could talk about trademarks and all kinds of stuff, copywriting, all kinds of issues, but there's a lot out there. So, the link to this article will be in our show notes, and there's so much more that we can talk about. I'm sure we're going to have you plenty more times on the show.
Hold on.
Oh, I'm
Breaking
sorry.
News,
I'm sorry.
Before you wrap,
Mm-hmm.
breaking news. I'm about to get an answer on the radio question.
Wait a minute. Are you going to find out if Biden is going to have a show with daffodils?
No,
is it being announced?
No, I'm getting an answer on whether they do releases
Oh,
from somebody that
boring.
That's boring. No one wants to hear that. We want to hear about the other show.
All right. Here it says we try to get one for every interview. We aren't always successful.
Okay.
Interesting.
And they have a nationally syndicated show where they have big name guests.
Wow. Okay.
So, there you are.
There you are. There it goes. And there
Because
you
I
are.
guess if they book it last minute, and they can't get it, they're not going to turn, the guest down because they didn't get the release form signed.
Right.
And they're usually talking about their latest book or album anyway, right? So
True.
yeah.
That's
yeah.
true. That's
Interesting.
True. All right. Well, thank you
Interesting
so much,
conversation.
Alex. This has been extremely, as soon as I saw the blog come across my email, I was like, man, I have to read this and have him on. And so I also encourage people to sign up for your newsletter as well. And so you have your website as Creating a Brand. And where else can they find you, Alex? They want to get in touch.
That's really it. I mean, creatingabrand.com is kind of my hub where I do everything. My social links are there, Podmatch is there. You can kind of find everything I do. And with that said, I want to say thank you to both of you for having me on. This is like a dream. Like I've seen you guys on stages at every conference I've ever been to
Oh my
in
gosh.
podcasting, and like getting to talk to you both. This is sweet. This was like
And
a
now
big
you
win
know
for
what
me.
real jerks we are. So
I'm like, I knew they couldn't be that nice in real life.
Only on the recordings.
That's it.
I'm going to send Alex a stamp that all it has on it is canceled. I'm going to send it
That'd be hilarious. Thank you so much, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Hello there, fellow Florida fans. We now have an official Patreon. In case you're unfamiliar, Patreon is a great way for community to support the creators of the content you love, like us, podcasters.
If you're enjoying the content we bring you on this show or any of the shows on the Florida Podcast Network, you can help ensure that content keeps coming through a small monthly donation. For just what it would cost you to get a cup of coffee, at Starbucks like you used to, you can make a real difference by helping us chip away at our production costs.
So if today's episode brought some sunshine, entertainment, and information to brighten your day, please help to see that these episodes keep coming by becoming a patron. Head to patreon.com/Florida Podcast Network to support the show. And it comes with some sweet benefits.
You want access to bonus extras, nostalgic for those old school radio shout-outs, lover of good quality merchandise? Well, not only will your monthly contribution help us grow the show, but you'll get some cool stuff too.
So please head to patreon.com/Florida Podcast Network for further details and to become a patron. That's Patreon, patreon.com/Florida Podcast Network.
You can also find the link right here in the show notes or by visiting Florida Podcast Network's website. And thanks in advance for not only being part of our listening community, but also for your continued support.
What a thought-provoking conversation that was with Alex. Oh my gosh. I hope you guys didn't get the fear of God like he mentioned his lawyer gives out. And like I got when I first read the article, I was like, oh my gosh. And I started getting the sweats. But such a good article and good conversation. So thank you again to Alex. So that, of course, brings us to our final tip. So what is it, Glenn?
I'd say get a lawyer before you get canceled.
That's right. I think that's an excellent tip.
Maybe buy some errors and omissions insurance.
Oh, and guess what? I just had to look that up actually the other day, and it's not quite as expensive as you might think. So I'm definitely going to invest in it for sure. Errors and omissions insurance.
You know, we couldn't get it for podcasters. You discovered that podcasters can get it now.
Yeah.
When I looked for it years ago, they didn't have it. You had to buy a radio one, and then the radio one declined us because we weren't radio.
They're like, they look down on us like, you don't deserve this.
Yeah. So
well, now it's available. Yes. And it was only like, I think I got a few different quotes. You know, obviously it's going to change depending on what numbers you put in, but the quotes I got were less than $100 a month. So if that can save me from this kind of fear of God, then I think it might be worth it. So we'll see. But so much good stuff here. But you can find more updates on all of this and other news, plus details and show notes about today's episode by going to floridapodcastingnews.com. We really, really, really love your feedback. So join us in our closed Facebook group. It's exclusively for super fans of Florida Podcast Network shows like this one. So just search for FPN Insiders on Facebook. You can leave us comments. You can gain access to stuff, early droplets of news, random things that I post up there. I posted up this article the other day of this guy. Oh my gosh, Florida. I know we love golf here in Florida, but we got to learn every once in a while to take a mulligan. Glenn, if you were playing golf, which I can't imagine you ever doing, but if you did, and a golf ball landed... I
did it very badly for a long time.
If a golf ball landed on the tail of an alligator, what would you do?
I'd take a picture.
Would you? You mean you wouldn't walk up and pick the golf ball up off of the alligator? Oh,
no, I lost a dozen golf balls a game. I wouldn't be doing that. No.
Yeah. So if you go to FPN Insiders on Facebook, you'll get to meet the chap who did that, because I posted the article all about it, and it's crazy. I just can't even believe it. But anyways, we look forward to meeting you in there. Or if you have any podcasting news to submit to the show, email me, as I mentioned earlier at the top of the hour, Jaime, Jaime at FloridaPodcastNetwork.com.
And be sure to visit all the great shows on the Florida Podcast Network. You can find them at FloridaPodcastNetwork.com. Until next time, thanks for hanging out on the inside of Florida's podcasting industry.